Imagine a world where the deepest secrets of human morality were not locked away in dense philosophical treatises or sacred texts, but were instead written in the everyday actions of the creatures around us. A world where medieval scientists and thinkers turned to the animal kingdom to decode the very essence of human virtue and vice. Picture these scholars, robed and curious, peering into the lives of beasts great and small, from the industrious ant to the noble lion, believing that within their instincts and interactions lay profound lessons about justice, loyalty, sacrifice, and sin. This wasn't just a passing fancy. It was a serious, sustained effort to understand what it means to be human by studying what it means to be animal. And what's truly remarkable is how this medieval practice, this blending of careful observation, moral allegory, and spiritual inquiry, still echoes in our modern conversations about ethics, natural law, and the biological roots of human behavior. As we embark on this journey together, we'll wander through the rich intellectual landscapes of the Middle Ages, a time when the boundaries between science, theology, and philosophy were beautifully blurred. We'll meet figures like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, who saw the natural world as a divine manuscript filled with symbols and stories waiting to be read. They believed that every creature, no matter how humble or fearsome, had a role in God's plan and a lesson for humanity. Through Bessieres, those enchanting illustrated manuscripts, and through first-hand observations, they extracted moral wisdom from the loyalty of dogs, the cooperation of bees, and even the cunning of foxes. These weren't just quaint tales, they were foundational to how medieval people understood their place in the universe and their responsibilities to one another. By the end of this video, you'll discover how this ancient, animal-centered approach to morality challenges some of our contemporary assumptions about ethics, where we often look inward to psychology or outward to technology for answers, forgetting that the natural world has been a teacher for millennia. You'll see how themes like natural law, social order, and personal virtue were explored through the lens of animal behavior, creating a tapestry of insight that remains surprisingly relevant today. Whether you're fascinated by history, intrigued by ethics, or simply curious about the unexpected connections between humans and animals, this exploration will offer you a new perspective on both the past and the present. So settle in, open your mind, and get ready to uncover a hidden chapter in the history of ideas, one that bridges the wildness of nature with the complexities of human morality, and invites us all to look a little closer at the world around us for guidance on how to live. To truly grasp why medieval thinkers turned to the animal kingdom for moral guidance, we need to step into their shoes and see the universe through their eyes. Theirs was not a world of random chance or disconnected parts, but a vast, intricately designed whole where everything and everyone had a specific, God-given purpose. This was a cosmos humming with meaning, where even the smallest, most mundane creature was a vital character in a divine story. Imagine looking at a sparrow, a spider, or a stag, and seeing not just a biological organism, but a living symbol, a page in a sacred text written by the hand of God Himself. This concept, known as the Book of Nature, was absolutely central. It held that God had created two books through which humanity could come to know Him: the Bible, which was the book of Scripture, and the natural world, which was the book of His creation. To read one was to better understand the other. To study a beehive's intricate social structure was, in a very real sense, to study theology. This world, was a powerful fusion of old and new wisdom. Medieval scholars stood on the shoulders of classical giants like Aristotle, whose detailed biological observations in works like History of Animals provided a foundational catalogue of creature behaviors. They also drew from encyclopedists like Pliny the Elder, whose Natural History was a sprawling compilation of facts, myths, and observations about the world. But these pagan texts were filtered through a distinctly Christian lens. Theologians interpreted the natural world not as a random collection of species, but as a deliberate creation, still bearing the imprint of the Creator's wisdom even after the fall of man. Every animal, from the industrious ant to the majestic eagle, was placed there for a reason: to serve humanity, to symbolize a spiritual truth, or to offer a lesson in how to live a virtuous life. Leading intellectual figures of the time championed this integrated approach. Albertus Magnus, a 13th-century German bishop and philosopher, was a relentless investigator of the natural world. He conducted remarkably detailed observations of animals, dissecting them and noting their habits with a scientist's eye, but always with a theologian's purpose. For him, a physical fact about an animal was never just a fact. It was a clue pointing toward a deeper, metaphysical truth. His student, Thomas Aquinas, would later systematize these ideas into a grand philosophical framework. Aquinas argued that divine law could be understood through human reason by observing the natural order, what he called natural law. Since animals acted according to their God-given natures without deviation, their behaviors provided the purest, most uncorrupted examples of this natural law in action. By watching them, humans could discern universal principles of charity, order, justice, and community that were woven into the very fabric of creation. This holistic perspective meant that the study of animals was never merely a branch of biology. It was a spiritual and ethical pursuit. A scholar wasn't just cataloging how a lion hunted. He was contemplating the nature of courage and kingship. He wasn't just noting that dogs were loyal to their masters. He was deriving a lesson on the virtue of fidelity. The entire natural world was a mirror held up to human society, reflecting both its idealized potential and its flawed reality. By examining the cooperation within a beehive or the ruthless selfishness of a wolf, medieval thinkers believed they could diagnose the health of their own communities and prescribe a path toward a more moral, harmonious existence. This wasn't a simplistic or naive project. It was a sophisticated intellectual endeavor that sought to find unity across all domains of knowledge, science, faith, and philosophy, all converging on the ultimate questions of how humans ought to live. Now, if the medieval worldview provided the stage, then Bessieres were the star performers, the blockbuster books of their day that brought this cosmic drama down to earth in vivid, unforgettable detail. These weren't dry academic texts gathering dust on monastery shelves. They were lavishly illustrated manuscripts, often bursting with color and gold leaf, designed to captivate the eye and instruct the soul. A bestiary was far more than a simple catalogue of creatures. It was a moral compass disguised as a natural history guide, a tool for ethical navigation using animals as its points of reference. Each entry followed a powerful, repetitive formula, described the creature, often mixing genuine observation with pure folklore, and then unveil its hidden spiritual meaning. This wasn't seen as deception, it was revelation. The physical reality of the animal was a doorway to a much deeper, transcendent truth. Take the pelican, one of the most enduring and potent symbols from these texts. Medieval bestiaries described a magnificent bird that, finding its young dead from snakebite, would pierce its own breast with its beak. Letting its blood fall upon the chicks, it would bring them back to life. Now, zoologically speaking, this is a myth. Pelicans don't do this, but for a medieval reader, the factual accuracy was almost beside the point. the story was true in the most important way possible. It revealed a profound spiritual reality. The pelican became the ultimate symbol of self-sacrificial love, a direct and powerful allegory for Jesus Christ, who shed his blood on the cross to redeem a dying humanity. Every time a person saw a pelican in a stained glass window or read about it in a book, they weren't just learning about a bird. They were receiving a visceral, emotional lesson in the core Christian tenets of sacrifice, redemption, and charity. On the other end of the spectrum was the humble ant, praised not for a dramatic mythical act but for its observable, everyday behavior. Bessieres celebrated the ant's relentless work ethic, its foresight in gathering grain during the summer to prepare for the barren winter. This was a straightforward, practical lesson in virtues like diligence, prudence, and planning for the future. It was a direct warning against the mortal sin of sloth. A preacher could point to an anthill and have a ready-made sermon about the importance of hard work and responsibility, making an abstract virtue instantly comprehensible to a farmer, a merchant, or a child. The ant didn't need a miraculous story. Its ordinary life was already a perfect sermon. This blending of the real and the mythical was a feature, not a bug, of the Bestiary tradition. The bonacon, a legendary beast said to defend itself by expelling corrosive, burning dung, was presented alongside the very real badger. The unicorn, which could only be captured by a pure maiden, stood beside the common fox. This might seem confusing to a modern scientific mind, but it made perfect sense within their framework. The purpose was not to create a zoological field guide, but to create a moral one. Whether an animal was physically real or allegorically real mattered less than the truth of the lesson it carried. The unicorn's story taught about purity and grace, while the fox's well-documented cunning served as a timeless warning against deceit and treachery. Theologians and educators of the era, like the influential Hugh of St. Victor, actively championed this method. They argued that humans, being physical creatures living in a physical world, learn best through physical examples. Abstract concepts like charity, envy, or piety are difficult to grasp, but a story about a loyal dog or a greedy wolf that sticks, that creates a mental image, an emotional hook that makes the ethical lesson memorable and compelling. Bestiaries were therefore not mere entertainment. They were fundamental pedagogical tools, a key part of the medieval educational curriculum designed to shape moral character from a young age. They bridged the gap between the lofty, often intimidating language of theology and the daily lived experience of ordinary people, making the path to virtue feel tangible, achievable, and woven into the very fabric of the world they walked through every day. To build this intellectual bridge between the natural world and human ethics, medieval scholars needed a sturdy philosophical foundation, and they found it in the work of an ancient Greek thinker who had walked this path centuries before, Aristotle. His ideas didn't just influence medieval science, they fundamentally shaped its entire approach, providing the logical backbone for why a scholar would look at a beehive and see a blueprint for a perfect society. Aristotle's exhaustive works, like History of Animals, were not simple catalogues of creatures, they were profound inquiries into the purpose and function of life itself. He meticulously documented the behaviors of hundreds of animals, from the reproductive habits of fish to the social structures of cranes, but he always did so with a philosopher's eye. For Aristotle, the goal was never just to list facts, it was to understand the telos, the inherent purpose or end goal of every living thing. He proposed that by observing how creatures perfectly fulfilled their natural roles, we could discern a universal, rational order to the cosmos, an order that also prescribed how rational humans should behave to achieve their own highest good, which is a life of virtue and flourishing. This is where his Nicomachean ethics and his biological studies powerfully converged. Aristotle argued that animals, acting purely on innate instinct, were flawless examples of this natural order in action. They were, in a sense, perfect in their own way because they could not deviate from their purpose. A bee could not choose to be lazy. It was driven by its nature to work for the hive. A wolf could not choose to be gentle. Its nature was to hunt and be ruthless. These behaviors were not random. They were manifestations of a deeper, rational structure governing all of life. Therefore, he suggested, humans, beings endowed with reason, could look to these animalian models to understand the principles of that natural order, and then consciously choose to emulate the positive traits and reject the negative ones. The cooperative hierarchy of bees became a model for a harmonious, efficient polis or city-state, where every citizen knows their role and works selflessly for the common good. The solitary, predatory nature of the wolf served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked individualism and greed that could tear a community apart. When these Aristotelian texts were rediscovered in medieval Europe, often through translations from Arabic scholars who had preserved and commented on them, they landed like an intellectual bombshell. But there was a potential problem. Aristotle was a pagan philosopher, not a Christian theologian. His worldview was based on reason and observation, not divine revelation. This is where brilliant medieval synthesizers like Albertus Magnus entered the picture, performing a remarkable act of intellectual fusion. Albertus, a Dominican friar and one of the most prolific writers of the Middle Ages, saw no contradiction between Aristotle's philosophy and Christian faith. In fact, he believed they complemented each other perfectly. He embraced Aristotle's empirical method, urging his students to go out and observe nature for themselves, to trust their eyes and their reason. But he framed this within a Christian context. If God is the creator of all things, then the natural order that Aristotle so brilliantly described is simply the physical expression of God's divine wisdom and intelligent design. Albertus and his even more famous student Thomas Aquinas took Aristotle's concept of a natural order and reframed it as natural law. This was a revolutionary idea. They proposed that God's moral law wasn't only found in the Scriptures, it was also written into the very fabric of creation, accessible to all people through the divinely gifted faculty of reason. And what was the purest, most uncorrupted text of this created world? Animal behavior. Since animals acted without free will, purely according to the nature God had given them, their actions were direct, unfiltered expressions of this natural law. The steadfast loyalty of a dog was not just a handy metaphor for fidelity. It was a living, breathing demonstration of a divine principle, the virtue of faithfulness. The cunning of a fox was a tangible lesson in the vice of deceit. By observing the animal kingdom, a person was quite literally reading a moral code authored by God. A code that provided clear, practical examples of virtues to cultivate and vices to avoid in the pursuit of a righteous life. This philosophical framework gave medieval scientists the ultimate justification for their work. It elevated the study of nature from a simple curiosity about the world to a sacred, almost devotional act. Every observation of a bird building a nest or an ant carrying a grain was a step closer to understanding the mind of God and His expectations for humanity. It created a seamless continuum where scraping the mud off your boots from a day spent observing badgers and sitting down to write a theological treatise on community were part of the same noble endeavor, the quest for moral truth. This is why they saw no separation. To them, the buzz of the beehive and the verses of the Bible were two chapters of the very same book, both essential for anyone seeking to learn how to live a good life. While the philosophical framework from Aristotle provided a rational structure, it was the deep currents of Christian theology that truly infused the medieval study of animals with its profound spiritual significance. This wasn't just an academic exercise, it was a form of devotion, a way of listening for the voice of the Creator in the chorus of His creation. The bedrock of this entire endeavor was the Bible itself, which repeatedly and explicitly directs the faithful to look to the animal kingdom for wisdom. The book of Proverbs offers one of the most direct commandments. Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. This single verse wasn't merely a suggestion. It was a divine instruction manual, authorizing and even obligating the believer to see in the ant's tireless work a lesson against laziness and a model for prudent preparation. Similarly, the book of Job is filled with majestic passages where God Himself speaks to Job out of the whirlwind, pointing to the wonders of the animal world, the strength of the behemoth, the freedom of the wild donkey, the keen sight of the hawk, as evidence of His power and inscrutable wisdom, humbling human arrogance and inviting a reverent awe. This scriptural foundation was powerfully developed by the early church fathers, most notably Augustine of Hippo, whose ideas would echo for centuries. Augustine formulated the crucial concept of the two books of divine revelation. The first and primary book was Scripture, the direct word of God, but the second book was the entire created universe, what he called the book of nature. For Augustine, these two books could never be in conflict because they had the same divine author. To study nature was to read a secondary but immensely valuable text that complemented and illuminated the primary one. Every creature, from the mightiest to the most minute, was a word placed there by God, a symbol carrying a message about His character, His plan, and His expectations for humanity. This transformed the natural world from a mere backdrop for human drama into a vibrant, speaking testament to divine glory. A scientist observing the migration patterns of birds was, in this light, also a theologian deciphering a sermon on divine providence and guidance. This theological lens gave every animal a specific symbolic weight, creating a rich and widely understood vocabulary of virtue and vice. The lamb became one of the most potent symbols, its innocence and silent acceptance of sacrifice making it a perfect prefiguration of Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This wasn't a casual metaphor, it was a central tenet of Christian art, literature, and liturgy, teaching congregations about purity, sacrifice, and redemption every time they saw a lamb depicted in a stained glass window or heard it referenced in a sermon. Conversely, the serpent, with its role in the Garden of Eden, was universally understood as the embodiment of temptation, deceit, and evil. Its physical nature, crawling on its belly, was seen as a direct consequence and eternal reminder of its sin, serving as a constant warning to believers to guard against cunning and pride. These symbols were not arbitrary. They were seen as God's own design, intentional clues embedded in creation to guide moral understanding. This perspective fundamentally shaped the daily work of monks and scholars in monasteries, which became hubs for this unique blend of faith and science. A monk tending a garden wasn't just growing food. He was observing the habits of insects and birds, seeing in the bee's industry a lesson in monastic diligence, and in the bird's reliance on divine provision a model for holy poverty. They kept menageries and studied the local wildlife, documenting their observations in Bestiaries and encyclopedias not as cold, objective facts, but as data points in a grand spiritual investigation. The patience of an ox pulling a plow taught a lesson in enduring hardship without complaint. The charity of a pelican, according to the beloved myth, taught about self-sacrificial love. Even the lowly hedgehog, said to roll on grapes to carry them to its young, was interpreted as a lesson in shrewdness and providing for one's family. Every behavior, no matter how small, was a potential parable waiting to be unpacked. This made the very act of studying an animal a pious, almost prayerful endeavor. To carefully observe a creature was to pay attention to a piece of God's handiwork, to honor the Creator by seeking to understand His art. It was a practice that cultivated virtues in the observer himself, humility, as he realized the complexity and wisdom inherent in even the smallest life forms, patience, as he spent long hours in observation, and wonder as he continually discovered new evidence of divine ingenuity. By interpreting animal actions through this unwavering theological lens, medieval scholars believed they were doing more than just compiling a natural history. They were actively participating in a divine dialogue, decoding messages that God had lovingly placed in the world around them as a universal guide for human morality, accessible to all who had the eyes to see and the heart to understand. Of all the creatures that captured the medieval imagination, none were more revered or more frequently cited as a moral exemplar than the humble bee. In the intricate, humming society of the beehive, scholars saw a mirror held up to their own world, a flawless blueprint for a harmonious, productive, and morally ordered human community. This wasn't a casual comparison. It was a deep, sustained analysis that found in the apiary a perfect model of divinely inspired cooperation. Medieval thinkers were absolutely fascinated by the way thousands of individual bees could function as a single, unified entity, each one surrendering its own autonomy for the unwavering good of the whole. They observed a society without idleness, without greed, and without rebellion, a stark contrast to the often messy and contentious world of human politics and social life. In the bee, they found an answer to a timeless question. What does a truly virtuous society look like in practice? The beehive structure offered a powerful metaphor for a rigid yet just social hierarchy, a concept that resonated deeply in the feudal world of kings, lords, and serfs. But for medieval moralists, this wasn't about justifying oppression. It was about illustrating the beauty of a system where every member understood and joyfully fulfilled their God-given role. They marveled at the clear division of labor, the single queen as a sovereign who ruled not through tyranny but through a life of dedicated service to propagation, the drones whose sole purpose was to ensure the future of the colony, and the vast legions of worker bees who acted as foragers, nurses, and architects without a hint of complaint. This natural hierarchy was held up as evidence of a distributive justice inherent in creation itself. Philosophers like Thomas Aquinas pointed to this system to argue that in a well-ordered human society, from the highest king to the lowest farmer, every person had a distinct function that contributed to the common welfare. The goal wasn't equality of outcome, but rather the peaceful and productive interdependence of different parts working in concert, much like the organs of a single body. This analogy extended powerfully into the realm of leadership and authority. The medieval bee king, often mistaken for a queen, was described not as a distant, privileged monarch, but as the heart of the hive, the central figure around which all life revolved. Bessieres noted that the swarm would never leave without their leader and would protect this central figure at all costs. This was interpreted as a profound lesson in loyal service to a rightful and benevolent ruler. Conversely, it also set an incredibly high standard for human kings and lords. To be a true leader was to be as indispensable and life-giving to one's people as the bee king was to the hive. It championed a model of servitude leadership where authority was granted in exchange for selfless dedication to the collective good. A human ruler who lived in luxury while his people starved was, by this natural standard, a failed and unnatural king, falling short of the example set by the insects in his own garden. Even the bee's most fearsome attribute, its sting, was loaded with moral significance. medieval texts didn't see the sting as a sign of inherent aggression. Instead, they interpreted it as a symbol of righteous and justified defense. A bee would only use its sting to protect the hive from a threat, an act that ultimately cost the bee its own life. This was the ultimate sacrifice for the community, a willingness to die to protect the home and the future embodied in the honeycomb. Preachers and moralists used this to discuss the difficult concept of a just war or the moral use of force. It taught that violence itself was not inherently sinful. It could be a tragic but necessary virtue when employed selflessly to defend one's community, one's faith, or one's family from a clear evil. The bee's sting was a natural parable cautioning against both pacifism in the face of danger and aggression for its own sake, advocating instead for a measured, communal response to threats. The lessons didn't stop at politics and defense. They also permeated everyday economic and personal ethics. The bee's legendary industriousness was a constant sermon against the sin of sloth. Their ability to transform the mundane nectar of flowers into precious, golden honey was seen as a divine alchemy, a model for how humans should take the raw materials of their lives and labor and turn them into something valuable and sustaining for the entire community. This provided a powerful religious justification for hard work, thrift, and productivity. A lazy person was not just harming themselves, they were failing in their duty to the hive, to the collective human project. The bee showed that work itself could be a form of worship, a way of participating in the fruitful abundance of God's creation. By meticulously observing these small creatures, medieval scientists and theologians were able to extract a comprehensive moral philosophy that addressed governance, justice, community defense, and personal responsibility, all from the buzzing activity right outside their monastery windows. While the beehive offered a grand model for society as a whole, medieval thinkers also turned their gaze to the individual virtues displayed by creatures, finding in their daily actions powerful, personal lessons for human conduct. At the forefront of these admired traits stood the unwavering loyalty of the dog, an animal that lived in such intimate proximity to humans that its devotion was impossible to ignore. Medieval scholars didn't just see a pet, they saw a living, breathing sermon on fidelity. The dog's instinct to protect its home, to greet its master with joy after an absence, and to stand guard against threats was celebrated as a pure, uncalculating form of loyalty. This was not a virtue born of complex reason or the hope of heavenly reward. It was an innate, steadfast commitment that seemed to flow directly from the creature's God-given nature. In a world structured by oaths of fealty between lords and vassals, the dog became the ultimate emblem of the ideal relationship, a being that served not out of fear or for personal gain, but out of a deep, instinctual bond of trust and duty. It served as a humbling mirror for humans who, despite their gift of reason, were so often fickle, treacherous, and quick to break their promises. The dog's simple, consistent faithfulness was a silent rebuke to human failings and a high standard to aspire to. This admiration for selfless dedication extended dramatically into the realm of parental sacrifice, where medieval bestiaries and encyclopedias were filled with stories, both real and mythical, that highlighted the ultimate cost of love. The elephant, a creature known to them mostly through awe-inspiring travelers' tales, was frequently described as a paragon of parental duty. Authors wrote of how elephant herds would form protective circles around their young when threatened, with the larger adults placing themselves in harm's way without hesitation. This was not seen as a simple biological instinct for species preservation. It was interpreted as a profound lesson in compassion, responsibility, and the lengths to which caring for the vulnerable should extend. Even more potent were the tales of certain birds like the partridge, which was said to feign injury, dragging a wing along the ground to lure predators away from its nest of vulnerable chicks. This act of calculated self-endangerment was held up as the purest form of self-sacrifice, a willing risking of one's own life for the certainty of another's survival. These narratives transformed the animal kingdom into a vast stage where the core tenets of charity and love were performed not with words but with actions. It is crucial to understand that these interpretations were far from mere sentimental stories. They were integral components of a sophisticated ethical framework that viewed the natural world as a direct expression of divine virtue. When a dog displayed loyalty or a bird acted with sacrificial courage, medieval scientists believed they were witnessing a physical manifestation of a spiritual truth. God, as the creator of all nature, had imbued these creatures with behaviors that illustrated the very qualities he desired in humanity. Therefore, the animal was not just a metaphor, it was a participant in a divine pedagogy, an unwitting teacher providing concrete, observable examples of abstract ideals. This is why scholars like Bartholomeus Anglicus, in his monumental encyclopedia on the properties of things, devoted such careful attention to documenting these behaviors. He wasn't just compiling a list of interesting facts, he was assembling a curriculum for moral development. He argued that by consciously observing and then imitating these animal virtues, humans could actively cultivate their own moral character. The diligence of the ant could become a man's prudence, the protective instinct of the elephant could become a woman's compassion, and the loyalty of the dog could become the foundation of trust in every community. This approach created a fascinating and somewhat paradoxical benchmark for human morality. Medieval philosophy placed humanity at the pinnacle of creation, endowed with rational souls and free will, gifts that set them far above the beasts. And yet, here were these same thinkers arguing that the irrational animals, acting on pure instinct, often outperformed humans in the practice of key virtues. A dog did not have to wrestle with temptation to be disloyal, it simply was loyal. A bird did not have to overcome fear to protect its young, it simply acted. This created a powerful call for self-reflection. It forced a person to ask a difficult question. If a creature without reason can achieve such perfect fidelity or sacrifice through instinct alone, then why do I, with my God-given reason and freedom to choose, so often fall short? This comparison was not meant to degrade humanity but to humble and inspire it. It suggested that morality was not an impossibly complex intellectual puzzle, but rather a matter of aligning one's will with the natural and divine order that was already on display all around them, in the actions of the simplest creatures. The animal world became a constant, gentle, and sometimes startling reminder of how to live a good life. Yet for all the admiration heaped upon the loyal dog or the selfless pelican, the medieval moral landscape would be incomplete without its shadows, the dark counterparts that served as essential warnings. If animals could model the virtues to aspire to, they could also embody the vices to flee from, providing a terrifyingly vivid gallery of moral failings. The fox, with its renowned cunning, became the archetype of deceit. Medieval Bessieres did not simply note the fox's skill in hunting, they painted it as a master of illusion and treachery. One popular tale described how a fox, feigning death, would lie motionless on its back until a careless bird, believing it to be a carcass, came close enough to be snatched. This wasn't just a hunting strategy to these thinkers, it was a full-blown allegory for the soul-destroying nature of hypocrisy and manipulation. The fox's deception was a direct parallel to the human sin of falsehood, the flatterer who offers sweet words only to betray, the corrupt merchant who uses trickery to gain an unfair advantage, or the heretic who spreads lies disguised as truth. The lesson was clear: a life built on cunning, no matter how successful it appears in the short term, is ultimately a hollow and condemned existence, as precarious as the fox's own life, constantly hunted by those it has wronged. The wolf prowled through these texts as an even more fearsome spectre, representing the twin vices of insatiable greed and predatory aggression. Its endless hunger and ruthless pack mentality made it the perfect symbol for the destructive force of unchecked ambition. Where the bee taught cooperative harmony, the wolf taught the chaos of pure selfishness. It was often used to criticize oppressive lords and barons who, like wolves, preyed upon the weaker members of their own society, the peasants and the poor, consuming their resources without a thought for the common good. This analogy extended to the spiritual realm as well. Preachers frequently described the devil himself as a ravening wolf, seeking to devour the souls of the faithful. The wolf's fate in these stories was never a happy one. It was always the hunted, the trapped, the creature driven by its own base instincts into a corner where it would inevitably meet its end. This narrative wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate theological point. The wolf's downfall served as a powerful metaphor for the concept of divine justice, teaching that a life consumed by greed and violence naturally leads to isolation, fear, and ultimate ruin. The predator, in the end, becomes the victim of its own monstrous nature. Perhaps the most visceral and universally understood warning came from a much more common animal, the pig. Associated overwhelmingly with filth and gluttony, the pig's habit of wallowing in mud and its seemingly indiscriminate appetite made it a walking, oinking sermon against the sins of overindulgence and a lack of self-control. In a society where periods of famine were a real threat, and where Christian teachings emphasized fasting and temperance, the pig became the embodiment of everything one should avoid. Its physicality was its moral lesson. To live like a pig was to surrender to one's basest appetites, to prioritize physical gratification over spiritual health, and to become so mired in the muck of material desires that one loses sight of higher virtues like purity and moderation. This symbolism was powerfully reinforced by biblical injunctions, such as the Gospel of Matthew's warning against casting pearls before swine, which framed the animal as fundamentally incapable of appreciating anything refined or holy. The pig, therefore, was not just an animal to be avoided at the dinner table. It was a state of being to be avoided in one's soul, a cautionary example of how a lack of discipline could reduce a rational human to the level of a brute beast. These negative exemplars were far more than simple condemnations. They were sophisticated psychological tools. It is one thing to tell an audience, "Do not be greedy." It is another entirely to show them a vivid image of a slavering wolf, its eyes glowing with hunger, ultimately brought down by its own rapaciousness. It is one thing to preach against deceit. It is far more effective to recount the story of the cunning fox, whose very cleverness becomes the trap that ensnares it. By grounding abstract vices in the tangible, observable behaviors of animals, medieval moralists made the consequences of sin immediate, memorable, and terrifyingly real. They created a moral ecosystem where every action had a natural consequence, mirroring their belief in a universe governed by divine justice. Just as a trapped fox paid the price for its deception, so too would a dishonest man face spiritual entrapment. Just as a hunted wolf met its end, so too would a greedy soul be pursued by its own damnation. This method allowed complex ethical failures to be discussed in a language that everyone, from the educated scholar to the illiterate farmer, could instantly understand and internalize, ensuring these lessons were woven into the very fabric of daily life and moral consciousness. But if the bee offered a model for society and individual animals, modeled personal virtues and vices, what was the grand, unifying theory that made all of this possible? What allowed a medieval scholar to look at a bird migrating south and see a lesson in divine providence, or to watch a mother bear protect her cub and derive a universal principle of charity? The answer lies in one of the most powerful and enduring concepts to emerge from the medieval mind, the idea of natural law. This was not a law in the sense of royal decrees or legal statutes written on parchment. This was something far more profound, a universal, unchanging moral code woven into the very fabric of the cosmos, a set of rules for righteous living that was as real and observable as the laws of physics that governed the falling of an apple or the orbit of a planet. And for these thinkers, the purest, most uncorrupted text of this natural law was written in the instinctual behaviors of the animal kingdom. At the heart of this concept was a revolutionary claim that morality was not merely a matter of cultural convention or divine command received through Scripture alone. Instead, it was something that could be discovered through the God-given faculty of human reason by simply observing the natural world. The towering figure who systematized this idea was Thomas Aquinas, who argued that God governed the universe through several layers of law. There was eternal law, which was the perfect divine reason known only to God himself. And then there was natural law, which was humanity's participation in that eternal law through our innate rational nature. But since humans, with our free will, often choose to ignore reason and act against this natural order, medieval philosophers needed a control group, a baseline of pure, undistorted natural behavior. And they found it in animals. A creature acting on instinct cannot choose to sin. It can only act according to the nature God designed for it. Therefore, its actions are a flawless expression of the natural law for its species. By studying these actions, humans could discern the underlying principles of that law, and then, using their reason, choose to align their own free will with it. This is why the migratory patterns of birds held such deep significance. Medieval observers noted how species like swallows or cranes would depart and return with uncanny seasonal precision, following invisible pathways across the sky. They saw in this not a blind biological impulse, but a profound lesson in providence, trust, and purpose. The birds did not question their journey. They simply followed the internal compass God had given them, arriving exactly where they needed to be to thrive. For a human being, this became a powerful allegory for the moral life. It suggested that each person is born with an innate moral compass, a natural inclination toward good, and that a virtuous life consists of trusting that compass and following its direction, despite the distractions and temptations that might try to pull them off course. The bird's migration was a silent sermon on the importance of having a fixed destination for one's soul and pursuing it with unwavering focus and trust in a higher plan. This framework gave medieval scientists the ultimate justification for their meticulous, almost devotional study of nature. They weren't just collecting curiosities, they were compiling evidence for a universal, objective moral standard. When they documented the universal drive of mammals to protect their young, they were pointing to a natural law principle of nurturing and charity. When they described the cooperative social structures of bees or wolves, they were highlighting the natural law principle of community and the common good. This idea of a law written into nature meant that these moral truths were accessible to everyone, everywhere, regardless of whether they had ever read the Bible or heard a sermon. A pagan philosopher observing a dog's loyalty could, in theory, deduce the virtue of fidelity. A traveler from a distant land watching ants store food for winter could understand the value of prudence. Animal behavior provided a common ground, a shared moral vocabulary that transcended cultural and religious differences because it was based on a reality observable by all. In this way, the medieval project of studying animals was perhaps one of the earliest attempts to build a truly interdisciplinary bridge. It connected the empirical, observational methods of what we would call science with the deepest questions of philosophy and theology. A scholar wasn't switching hats between biologist and moralist. He was wearing one single, integrated hat of a natural philosopher. He believed that by carefully collecting data on how the world is, he could reliably derive conclusions about how we ought to live. The animal kingdom, in its innocent obedience to its created nature, provided a living blueprint, a detailed set of architectural plans for building a moral life and a just society. It was a blueprint that asserted that right and wrong were not human inventions, but were as real and discoverable as the hive of the honeybee or the flight path of the goose, waiting for any rational creature with open eyes and a thoughtful mind to read them and understand. While the grand philosophical and theological frameworks provided the why, the practical methods of how medieval scholars actually studied animals reveal a fascinating and surprisingly rigorous approach to gathering knowledge. We might picture these figures as dusty academics hunched over ancient manuscripts in dimly lit scriptoriums, and while that was certainly part of it, their work was far more hands-on and empirical than we often assume. They were, in their own way, field biologists, ethologists, and experimental psychologists, piecing together an understanding of the natural world with the tools they had available. Their primary resource was the vast repository of knowledge inherited from classical antiquity, the works of Aristotle with his incredibly detailed biological observations, and Pliny the Elder's sprawling, encyclopedic natural history served as the foundational textbooks. These were not merely copied, they were scrutinized, debated, and used as a baseline against which new observations could be compared. To this, they added a constant stream of new data from a surprising source: travelers. Pilgrims returning from the Holy Land, merchants navigating the Silk Road, and missionaries venturing into uncharted territories would bring back astonishing tales of exotic creatures like elephants, crocodiles, and parrots. These first-hand accounts, often a mixture of careful description and wild exaggeration, were eagerly collected and integrated into the growing body of natural knowledge, constantly expanding the medieval mental map of God's creation. Yet the most significant advances came from those who moved beyond the library and into the field. A spectacular example of this hands-on inquiry is the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II of Hohenstaufen. This remarkable ruler was not only a powerful political figure but a dedicated naturalist who poured his passion into a monumental work, the art of hunting with birds. This was far more than a hobbyist's guide to falconry. It was a deeply scientific treatise based on years of meticulous observation and even experimentation. Frederick would keep detailed records of his birds' behaviors, their training methods, their diets, and their responses to different stimuli. He noted the fierce loyalty a well-treated falcon showed its handler and the intense focus it displayed during the hunt. For Frederick, these were not just interesting bird facts, they were data points in a moral investigation. He saw in the falcon's discipline training a model for human self-mastery, and in the mutual respect between bird and hunter, a paradigm for the ideal relationship between a ruler and his subjects. His work demonstrates a seamless blend of empirical science and ethical inquiry, where every observed behavior was a potential lesson in leadership, patience, and mentorship. The true engines of this animal-based research, however, were the monasteries that dotted the European landscape. These religious communities became unlikely hubs of scientific activity. Many maintained small menageries or had easy access to the local wildlife in their surrounding forests and fields. Monks, charged with the duty of reading the Book of Nature, would spend hours observing the creatures around them. They documented the relentless, coordinated work of ants, seeing in it a lesson on communal perseverance and the virtue of preparing for life's hardships. They charted the impeccable timing of migrating swallows, interpreting their unwavering annual journey as a powerful allegory for the human soul's pilgrimage toward a heavenly home, a lesson in trust and divine guidance. This monastic observation was a form of prayerful attention, a belief that by closely studying the details of a creature's life, one could come closer to understanding the mind of its creator. Their notebooks were filled with these observations, which then fed into the creation of Bestiaries and encyclopedias, ensuring that the symbolic lessons were always grounded in at least some kernel of observable reality. It's crucial to recognize that their methods, while lacking modern technology, were fundamentally systematic. They practiced a form of early empiricism, prioritizing direct observation and experience alongside the authority of ancient texts. They compared accounts, sought out corroborating evidence, and attempted to verify the more fantastical tales they heard from travelers. The goal was always to uncover truths about nature that could, in turn, inform deeper moral and theological discussions. A description of a bird's nesting habit was never an end in itself. It was the raw material for a sermon on domesticity and care. The recording of a lion's behavior was data for a discourse on kingship and power. This unique fusion, blending careful data collection with rich allegorical interpretation, created a distinctive form of science where the line between the empirical and the ethical was beautifully blurred. For these scholars, to collect a fact about an animal was to simultaneously gather a tool for moral reflection, proving that the quest to understand our place in the world often begins with the simple, profound act of looking closely at the lives of the creatures around us. While the intellectual engines of medieval Europe were humming in monasteries and universities, they were powerfully fueled by a stream of knowledge flowing from a brilliant and vibrant scholarly tradition to the south and east, the world of Islamic science. To fully appreciate the medieval project of deriving morality from nature, we must journey beyond the walls of Paris and Oxford to the great centers of learning in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, where philosophers and scientists were engaged in a remarkably parallel endeavor. The European approach, which we've seen blending Aristotle with Christianity, did not develop in a vacuum. It was profoundly shaped by the works of Islamic scholars who had not only preserved the classical knowledge of Greece, but had dramatically advanced it, creating a rich and sophisticated body of work that viewed the natural world through a similar, yet uniquely illuminating lens. At the forefront of this intellectual exchange were towering figures like Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, and the innovative polymath Abu Uthman Amr ibn Bar, famously called Al-Jahiz. Centuries before Albertus Magnus began his observations, Al-Jahiz was composing his monumental Kitab al-Hayawan, or Book of Animals, a sprawling encyclopedia that was a marvel of its age. This was no simple bestiary. It was a groundbreaking work that wove together meticulous empirical observation, keen philosophical insight, and sharp social commentary. Al-Jahiz carefully described the behaviors of countless creatures, from the cooperative strategies of ants to the hunting techniques of lions, but his genius lay in how he used these observations. He saw in the animal kingdom a grand mirror for human society, arguing that the traits animals displayed, both admirable and condemnable, offered direct lessons for human conduct. His discussions of animal cooperation and mutual aid were not just biological notes. They were powerful arguments for social virtues like solidarity, justice, and community support, suggesting that these ethical principles were woven into the very fabric of the natural world, ordained by the Creator. The resonance of this work, and others like it by scholars such as Avicenna, with the European medieval mind cannot be overstated. When these Arabic texts began to be translated into Latin in centers like Toledo, Spain, in the 12th and 13th centuries, they landed with the force of a revelation. Here were incredibly detailed, rational, and systematic studies that supported the very project European thinkers were embarking upon. They provided a much broader and more diverse database of animal examples, drawing on species from Africa and Asia unknown to European naturalists. More importantly, they provided a sophisticated philosophical framework that perfectly complemented the one being built by scholars like Aquinas. Islamic scholars operated within a theological context that saw the entire natural world as ayat, or signs of God's wisdom and majesty. Every creature, every behavior was a testament to the creativity and intelligence of the divine. This perspective was instantly familiar and deeply appealing to Christian scholars who were themselves trying to read the book of nature as a testament to God's work. It was a case of intellectual kinship across faiths. Both traditions shared the fundamental belief that the universe was created by a single, all-wise God, and that studying his creation was a sacred act that could lead to a deeper understanding of his will and his moral laws. This cross-cultural exchange did more than just provide new facts. It fundamentally enriched and nuanced the European approach. The integration of Islamic knowledge helped move the discussion beyond simple allegory and toward a more complex comparative ethics. European scholars were now armed with a wider array of interpretations and examples. They could compare the fox in Aesop's Fables with the fox described by Al-Jahiz, building a more robust portrait of cunning and its consequences. The Islamic emphasis on careful observation and rational classification bolstered the empirical side of the European endeavor, encouraging a more critical eye toward the more fantastical elements of traditional Bessieres. It helped solidify the idea that animal behavior could serve as a reliable, objective moral guide because it was being documented and analyzed by the most advanced scientific minds of the known world, regardless of their religion. This wasn't a one-way street of knowledge transfer. It was the creation of a shared intellectual project that spanned continents and faiths, all focused on a single, profound question: what can the creatures of the earth teach us about how to live? The bridge built by these Islamic scholars didn't just transport knowledge from east to west. It connected two great rivers of thought, merging them into a more powerful and profound current that would shape the course of science and ethics for centuries to come. While scholars debated natural law in Latin texts, the true heartbeat of this animal-centered morality pulsed through the stories told to everyone, everywhere. The lessons of the Bestiaries and the philosophers didn't stay locked in university lecture halls. They sprang to life in the vibrant tradition of fables and literature, becoming the common property of kings and peasants alike through tales that were as entertaining as they were instructive. At the very core of this popular education were the fables attributed to the ancient storyteller Aesop, collections of which circulated widely throughout the Middle Ages. These deceptively simple stories, featuring a cast of clever foxes, slow but steady tortoises, and vain crows, were masterclasses in ethical reasoning disguised as children's entertainment. The story of the tortoise and the hare wasn't just a fun race. It was a powerful visual argument for the virtue of perseverance over arrogance, teaching that consistent, humble effort will always outlast flashy but unfocused talent. The fable of the fox and the sour grapes provided a timeless psychological insight, offering a memorable label for the very human tendency to disparage what we cannot have, a lesson in self-deception and the importance of honest self-assessment. These narratives gave people a shared vocabulary for discussing complex flaws and virtues, all through the safe, relatable medium of animal characters. This literary tradition found its most powerful amplifier in the medieval church, where preachers recognized a golden opportunity to connect with their congregations. Standing in the pulpit before an audience of mostly illiterate laypeople, a priest couldn't delve into the intricate arguments of Thomas Aquinas on natural law. But he could tell a story, and the stories everyone already knew and loved were about animals. Sermons became a primary vehicle for these allegories, with preachers skillfully weaving animal tales into their explanations of scripture and morality. The cunning of the serpent from the Garden of Eden was no longer a distant, mythical event. It became a warning about the smooth-talking neighbor who might lead you into a bad business deal, or the internal voice tempting you to gossip. The loyalty of the dog could be invoked to shame a congregation into being more faithful in their attendance or their tithes. This method was brilliantly effective because it translated abstract, intimidating theological concepts into something tangible and unforgettable. A farmer might forget a lecture on the 7 deadly sins, but he would remember the image of the gluttonous pig wallowing in filth, a visceral warning against overindulgence that he could see right there in his own barnyard. The influence of this tradition reached its zenith in the works of great writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, who brilliantly weaponized animal allegory to explore the most complex facets of human experience. In his poem The Parliament of Fowls, Chaucer doesn't just use animals as simple stand-ins for single virtues or vices. He creates a whole-feathered society to stage a nuanced debate about love, desire, and social class. The poem describes a gathering of birds on Valentine's Day, where eagles, noblest of the birds, debate points of courtly love and passion with a refined and formal rhetoric. Meanwhile, the lower-class birds, the duck, the goose, the cuckoo, chime in with their own practical, down-to-earth, and often hilariously frank opinions on the matter. Here, the natural behavior of the birds, the eagle's soaring majesty, the duck's aquatic commonness, is used to mirror and critique the rigid social hierarchies of Chaucer's own world. The poem is both a charming fantasy and a sharp piece of social commentary, using the avian parliament to ask profound questions about whether matters of the heart should be governed by aristocratic rules or natural impulse. It demonstrated that animal allegory could be used not just for simple lessons, but to explore the most sophisticated and contested ideas of the day. This pervasiveness across all levels of culture, from the peasant's fireside tale to the nobleman's book of poetry to the priest's Sunday sermon, cemented the idea that nature was a universal teacher. You didn't need a university degree to read the book of nature. You just needed to pay attention to the world around you. This literary tradition ensured that the moral symbolism of animals was a shared language, a common currency of wisdom that everyone could understand and use. It made ethical reflection a daily, accessible practice, woven into the very fabric of entertainment and worship. By embedding these lessons in narratives that were engaging, humorous, and emotionally resonant, medieval culture guaranteed that the lessons would stick, passed down from generation to generation, not as dry commandments, but as living stories. This widespread and deeply embedded use shows that turning to the animal kingdom for moral guidance wasn't a quirky sidebar to medieval thought. It was absolutely central to how an entire civilization understood itself and its place in the universe. But this deep well of animal symbolism wasn't just confined to the pages of books or the words of preachers. It spilled out into the very visual landscape of medieval life, transforming art, architecture, and identity into a vibrant gallery of moral instruction. Walk into any great cathedral or glance at a nobleman's shield, and you would be immediately surrounded by a silent zoo of virtue and vice, where every creature carved in stone, painted on glass, or embroidered on silk carried a weight of meaning far beyond its biological form. This visual language was a universal code, instantly recognizable to everyone from a king to a common farmer. making the pursuit of moral excellence a tangible, ever-present part of the daily environment. The lion, with its majestic mane and fearless demeanor, became the ultimate symbol of royal courage and righteous authority, its image adorning thrones, tapestries, and the seals of kings who sought to project these very qualities. To depict a lion was to invoke an entire philosophy of leadership, one that demanded strength tempered by nobility and power exercised with a sense of sacred duty. Similarly, the eagle, soaring higher than any other bird and believed to be able to gaze directly into the sun, symbolized piercing vision and transcendent authority. It represented the ability to see divine truth beyond the clouds of earthly confusion, making it a favored emblem for empires and evangelists alike, a constant reminder to look upward for guidance. In the realm of religious art, these symbols were woven into narratives that brought theological concepts to stunning, emotional life. The story of Daniel, serene and unharmed in a den of ravenous lions, was a perennial favorite for stained glass windows and manuscript illustrations. This wasn't merely a depiction of a miraculous event. It was a powerful visual sermon on the rewards of unwavering faith. The lions, symbols of terrifying earthly power, become helpless in the face of divine protection, teaching viewers that true safety comes not from physical strength but from spiritual conviction. Centuries later, the figure of Saint Francis of Assisi preaching to a flock of attentive birds served a parallel purpose. This scene beautifully illustrated a radical humility and a sense of kinship with all creation. It showed a holiness that wasn't about dominating nature, but about communing with it, suggesting that even the simplest creatures were worthy of respect and capable of understanding divine harmony. These artworks were not just decorations, they were silent, potent sermons that shaped the moral imagination of every person who passed beneath them, reinforcing the lessons learned from Bessieres in the most visceral way possible. Perhaps the most personal and public integration of this symbolism was in the system of heraldry. A knight's coat of arms was his family's resume, its brand, and its moral declaration all rolled into one vivid emblem. The animals chosen were never random. They were a carefully curated menagerie of aspirational traits. A bear might denote immense strength and ferocity in protection of one's kin and lands. A stag or hart, perpetually alert and difficult to hunt, symbolized vigilance, agility, and a connection to the untamed spirit of the forest. Even mythical creatures found a home here. The griffin, with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle, combined the king of beasts with the king of birds to create a symbol of unparalleled valor and vigilance, a guardian of divine treasure. These symbols were proudly displayed on shields, banners, and surcoats, turning the chaos of the battlefield and the politics of the court into a landscape of walking, talking moral allegories. When two knights faced each other, they were not just seeing an opponent, they were confronting a set of virtues embodied in the heraldic creatures before them, a lion of courage versus a bear of strength, a visual clash of ideals. This rich tapestry of visual symbolism was profoundly intentional, a direct extension of the scholarly work happening in monasteries. The lion's artistic representation drew directly from bestiary descriptions of its nobility, such as the belief that a lion would spare a prostrate enemy, showing mercy. The eagle's association with vision came from observed tales of its incredible eyesight. This created a beautiful feedback loop. Natural observation and lore informed the moral allegory, which then informed the artistic symbol, which in turn reinforced the moral teaching for society at large. By embedding these animal emblems into the very fabric of daily life on the walls of their churches, the flags of their lords, and the seals on their documents, medieval society ensured that the connection between animal behavior and human ethics was not an abstract academic idea. It was a living, breathing presence, a continuous visual reminder that the path to virtue was all around them, encoded in the forms of the creatures they saw every day, urging them to embody the courage of the lion, the purity of the dove, and the watchfulness of the stag. For all its profound influence, this grand project of reading morality into the animal kingdom was not without its internal dissent and thorny complications. Even within the medieval scholarly world, sharp minds recognized the inherent limitations of building a human ethical system on the foundation of beastly instinct. Some of the most pointed critiques came from within the ranks of the scholastics themselves, philosophers who embraced Aristotelian logic and reason. They raised a fundamental, almost unanswerable objection. Animals lack reason and free will. A dog is loyal not because it has consciously chosen the virtue of fidelity over the vice of treachery. It is loyal because its God-given nature compels it to be. Its action, however admirable, is one of innate programming, not moral deliberation. Human ethics, these critics argued, exist on an entirely different plane. Our virtue is only truly virtuous when it is chosen freely, after a struggle with temptation and a rational understanding of the good. To simply imitate an animal, therefore, is to bypass the very faculties reason and free will that make human morality meaningful and meritorious in the first place. This wasn't just a philosophical nitpick, it struck at the core of the entire endeavor, suggesting that animal behavior could inspire us, but it could never serve as a direct blueprint for a rational moral life. This theoretical problem became painfully concrete when observers turned their gaze to the darker, brutal side of nature. If the self-sacrificing pelican was a symbol of Christ, what was one to make of the spider that devours its mate, or the cuckoo that lays its egg in another bird's nest, condemning the host's own chicks to death? The natural world was just as full of what looked like cruelty, deceit, and chaos as it was of cooperation and virtue. This presented a massive challenge to the idea of a perfectly designed natural order reflecting divine goodness. How could a merciful God create creatures with instincts for such apparent evil? Medieval scholars addressed this uncomfortable reality by folding it into the Christian narrative of the fall. They argued that the entire created world, not just humanity, had been corrupted by original sin. The violence and predation seen in nature were not part of God's initial perfect design, but were tragic consequences of a broken world, a kind of spiritual entropy that had infected all of creation. Therefore, these negative behaviors could not be emulated. Instead, they had to be read as negative allegories. The cruel and predatory instincts of a wolf weren't a model to follow but a stark warning against the sins of greed and rapaciousness, a living example of the corruption that follows a turn away from divine harmony. A different kind of challenge to the project's credibility came from its own sources. The beloved Bessieres, for all their moral utility, were often riddled with outright fables. The reliance on mythical creatures like the unicorn, purified only by a virgin's touch, or the immortal phoenix that rises from its own ashes, created a tension between the empirical and the symbolic. These stories were powerful allegories for purity and resurrection, but they were built on creatures that no scholar could ever actually observe. As the medieval period progressed and direct observation became more valued, this over-reliance on mythical beasts began to undermine the empirical credibility of the entire natural philosophy enterprise. It opened the door for critics to question whether any of the animal lessons were based in reality or were merely convenient fictions constructed to support pre-existing moral conclusions. This highlighted a constant balancing act for medieval thinkers, navigating the pull of powerful, useful symbolism against the emerging push for factual, observable truth. These accumulating limitations and critiques did not bring the project to a halt, but they did force a significant and sophisticated refinement of it. They sparked intense debates about the proper sources of moral knowledge. Some thinkers began to advocate for a recentering of ethics squarely on the human faculties of reason and the direct study of Scripture, arguing that these were more reliable guides than the ambiguous text of the natural world. This wasn't a rejection of nature's beauty or its role in inspiring awe, but a growing acknowledgement that the ultimate authority for human morality had to be rooted in the human condition and divine revelation. What's most remarkable about this internal criticism is that it reveals the medieval intellectual world was not a monolith of uncritical belief. It was a vibrant, disputatious community capable of self-reflection and course correction. The very act of wrestling with these problems, of trying to reconcile the lion's nobility with the spider's cruelty, or the useful allegory of the unicorn with its non-existent biology, forced a deeper and more nuanced approach. It pushed scholars to be more careful in their observations, more precise in their distinctions, and more humble in their claims. This capacity for self-criticism ensured that the medieval dialogue on animals and ethics remained a dynamic and evolving conversation, one that was aware of its own limits even as it marveled at the profound lessons the natural world seemed to offer. This fascinating tension between animal instinct and human reason lies at the very heart of the medieval ethical project, creating a profound and sometimes unsettling mirror for self-reflection. If animals were such perfect, unerring examples of natural virtue, simply by following their God-given programming, then what did that say about humans with our supposedly superior gift of reason? Medieval philosophers dove headfirst into this paradox, and their conclusions were both humbling and empowering. They arrived at a crucial distinction. While animals flawlessly enact the natural law through pure instinct, humans alone have the capacity, and therefore the profound responsibility, to understand and consciously choose that same good. An ant doesn't debate whether to store food for the winter. It simply does so, achieving a kind of perfect, thoughtless virtue. A dog doesn't weigh the pros and cons of loyalty. Its devotion is immediate and absolute. Humans, on the other hand, are presented with a constant stream of choices, tempted by vice and distracted by self-interest, often failing to meet the simple, instinctual standards set by the beasts. This wasn't meant to degrade humanity, but to highlight our unique and weighty role in the cosmic order. We are not meant to merely imitate, we are meant to comprehend and then willingly align our free will with the divine plan we see reflected in nature. Thinkers like the great Franciscan theologian Bonaventure developed this idea with beautiful clarity. He suggested that the animal world operates in a state of graceful simplicity, each creature fulfilling its purpose without error or deviation, acting as a direct and uncorrupted expression of God's will. Their actions are, in a sense, prayer in motion. Humans, blessed with reason and free will, inhabit a much more complex and fraught moral landscape. Our highest calling isn't to achieve the mindless perfection of an ant, but to use our intellect to discern the good and then summon the courage of our will to choose it, even when it is difficult. This makes our virtue, when we achieve it, a far more significant accomplishment. The loyalty of a dog is admirable, but it is innate. The loyalty of a human, maintained through trials, temptations, and the constant possibility of betrayal, is a hard-won victory of character. This comparison served as a powerful tool for moral exhortation. A preacher could pointedly ask his congregation why they, with their rational souls, struggled with the very diligence that came so naturally to the lowly ant, or why they failed to show the steadfast fidelity of a common hound. It was a rhetorical strategy designed to provoke a sense of holy shame. a motivating push toward self-improvement by holding up the unthinking virtue of animals as a benchmark we rational creatures should feel compelled to surpass. This framework ultimately positioned animal behavior not as a strict blueprint to be copied, but as a source of pure inspiration and a reminder of a lost harmony. The animal kingdom represented a kind of moral baseline, a glimpse into the natural law as it was meant to be followed before the complications of human sin and reason entered the picture. It was a humbling mirror, reflecting back to us a simpler, more obedient version of existence that we had strayed from. Yet this admiration was always balanced by the recognition of human uniqueness. Our ability to reason, to philosophize, to theologize, to understand the why behind the virtue was our greatest gift. It allowed us to transform blind instinct into conscious moral philosophy, to move from simply acting loyally to understanding the profound value of loyalty itself for building a just society. This nuanced view prevented a descent into a simplistic nature worship. It acknowledged that we could learn from the ants' hard work, but we could also build cathedrals, write symphonies, and develop legal systems, creative acts that belong to the realm of reason far beyond instinct. The medieval synthesis, therefore, was not about becoming more animalistic, but about using our rational faculties to consciously recover the virtuous harmony displayed in nature, elevating it through understanding and choice. This delicate balance, which both celebrated animal exemplars and championed human rationality, created a sophisticated ethical foundation that would deeply influence later thinkers wrestling with the relationship between nature, reason, and divine law. This profound connection between the animal kingdom and human ethics was never meant to be locked away in scholarly texts. It was designed to be lived, a practical toolkit for navigating the complexities of daily existence. Medieval thinkers were intensely focused on application, tirelessly working to translate the lofty symbols of the Bestiaries and the complex theories of natural law into clear, actionable guidance for everyone, from the highest knight to the youngest child. They understood that for a moral lesson to truly take root, it had to find its way into the rhythm of everyday life, shaping decisions both mundane and monumental. This drive to make abstract virtue tangible transformed their philosophical project into a powerful force that actively sculpted medieval society, embedding animal wisdom into the very fabric of how people managed their homes, raised their children, and structured their most devout communities. Consider the humble ant, a creature so small yet so profoundly influential in the domestic sphere. The ant's legendary habit of storing grain for the winter was not just a curious factoid for medieval moralists, it was a masterclass in economics and household management. Preachers and writers would hold up the ant as the ultimate model of prudence and frugality, a living rebuke to the human tendencies of short-sightedness and wastefulness. In an era without the safety nets of modern banking or insurance, the ant's example provided a divine mandate for planning ahead. A family that carefully saved a portion of their harvest, mended their tools, and avoided unnecessary debt was not merely being thrifty, they were enacting a sacred virtue, aligning their domestic economy with the natural law so perfectly demonstrated by this tiny insect. This lesson was especially crucial for the vast majority of the population who lived on the edge of subsistence, where a single bad season could mean starvation. The ant's diligence became a spiritual and practical imperative, a way of participating in God's orderly providence by taking responsible action for the future. On the opposite end of the social spectrum, the lion's courage was invoked to shape the very identity of the medieval warrior class. The education of a young knight in training was steeped in animal symbolism. He would be taught that true courage was not mere brutish aggression, but the noble, controlled strength of the lion, an animal said to be magnanimous, sparing those who submitted and fighting only for a just cause. Heraldic symbols emblazoned on shields and banners were constant visual reminders of these aspirational traits. A knight bearing the image of a lion was making a public vow to embody its fearlessness and leadership in battle, while also embracing its supposed mercy in victory. This was more than just inspirational imagery. It was a code of conduct, a chivalric ideal directly sourced from the natural world. The lion provided a concrete standard against which a knight could measure his own actions on the battlefield, asking himself in a moment of conflict, "Am I fighting with the righteous fury of the lion or the base savagery of a wolf?" This animal exemplar helped refine the concept of martial virtue, elevating it from simple violence to a complex ideal of protective, honorable strength. Perhaps the most enduring and effective application of this animal-based morality was in the education of children. Long before they could grapple with the dense prose of Aquinas, youngsters were learning their moral alphabet through the vibrant stories of Aesop's fables and other beast tales. These narratives were the perfect pedagogical tool, turning abstract concepts into unforgettable characters and plots. A child listening to the story of the tortoise and the hare didn't need a lecture on the sin of pride or the virtue of perseverance. They saw it play out in a dramatic race, internalizing the lesson that slow, steady effort could triumph over flashy arrogance. The tale of the boy who cried wolf taught the tangible social consequences of dishonesty in a way that a simple commandment could not. These stories worked because they spoke to the imagination, creating mental hooks for ethical principles that would last a lifetime. They made morality a conversation starter between parents and children, a shared language built around the ant, the grasshopper, the fox, and the crow. This ensured that from their earliest years, individuals were conditioned to look to the natural world for guidance, a habit of mind that would stay with them into adulthood. Nowhere was this practical application more systematic and intentional than within the walls of medieval monasteries. Monastic rules, the foundational documents that governed daily life for monks and nuns, were peppered with references to animal behavior, using them as divine justifications for the rigorous structure of communal living. The beehive, as we've seen, was the quintessential model. Its perfectly ordered hierarchy and the selfless labor of every bee for the good of the hive were presented as the blueprint for the ideal religious community. A monk was expected to emulate the worker bee, obedient to his abbot, the hive's king, diligent in his assigned task, whether that was copying manuscripts, brewing ale, or tending the garden, and utterly devoted to the collective health of the spiritual hive over any individual desire. This wasn't a suggestion, it was the core of monastic identity. Similarly, the patience of the ox under yoke was invoked to encourage monks to endure the hardships of their ascetic life without complaint, accepting their burdens as their divine duty. By framing their rules through these natural analogies, monastic founders made the demanding path of religious life feel less like a set of arbitrary restrictions and more like a return to a fundamental, God-ordained order, a way of living in harmony with the patterns visible throughout all of creation. This pervasive integration of animal lessons into domestic, educational, and institutional life reveals the ultimate goal of the medieval project. It was a comprehensive endeavor to shape character and behavior at every level of society. By weaving these examples into sermons, fables, rules, and symbols, medieval culture created a seamless web of moral instruction that felt both timeless and immediately relevant. It provided a common ethical vocabulary that could be understood by the illiterate peasant and the Latin-speaking scholar alike, bridging social divides with shared stories and symbols. This hands-on approach ensured that the study of animal behavior was never an idle pastime but a vital, living tradition that offered clear, relatable, and divinely sanctioned answers to the most pressing human questions. How should I manage my resources? How should I face danger? How should I raise my children? How should I live with others? The animal kingdom, in all its diversity, provided a rich and endlessly fascinating source of answers. The echoes of this medieval fascination did not fade with the end of the Middle Ages. Instead, they reverberated through the centuries, morphing and adapting to fuel some of the most transformative intellectual movements in Western history. The Renaissance, with its rediscovery of classical texts and its burgeoning spirit of humanistic inquiry, retained a deep reverence for the natural world as a source of wonder and knowledge. While the overt religious allegory of the Bestiaries began to wane, the fundamental practice of looking to animals to understand humanity not only persisted but flourished. Renaissance naturalists, armed with a new empirical curiosity, embarked on detailed studies of creature anatomy and behavior, yet they often did so with a lingering sense that these details revealed something universal about life itself. Leonardo da Vinci's exquisite anatomical drawings of horses and birds were not merely scientific records. They were investigations into the mechanics of motion and design, seeking the divine geometry that underpinned all living things. This period saw the medieval book of nature remain open, its pages now studied with a fresh emphasis on direct observation, yet still read for the profound truths it might hold about the human condition. This intellectual trajectory exploded into the Enlightenment, where the medieval concept of natural law was secularized and thrust into the center of philosophical debate about human rights and social organization. Thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau powerfully invoked the animal kingdom in his discourse on the social contract, using the figure of the noble savage and the state of nature to critique the corruptions of modern civilization. For Rousseau, animals represented a purer, more innocent state of existence, free from the artificial inequalities and vices that plagued human society. His speculation that human morality had its roots in a natural pity or compassion that we share with other animals was a direct, though more systematic, continuation of the medieval project. He was essentially arguing that by observing the innate social instincts of creatures, we could discern the original, uncorrupted blueprint for human community, a world before the introduction of property, jealousy, and hierarchical power. In this way, the Enlightenment's entire project of grounding ethics in reason and universal human nature, rather than solely in divine revelation, owes a quiet debt to those medieval scholars who first insisted that moral principles could be rationally discovered by studying the created world. The legacy finds its most direct modern incarnation in the rigorous scientific fields of ethology and evolutionary psychology. These disciplines have stripped away the allegory and theology, replacing them with controlled observation, hypothesis testing, and genetic analysis. Yet their central question remains hauntingly familiar: what can animal behavior tell us about ourselves? When ethologists like Konrad Lorenz study the imprinting instincts of geese, or Jane Goodall documents the complex social bonds and tool use of chimpanzees, they are building a data-driven picture of traits like attachment, cooperation, and even aggression that are deeply embedded in our shared biological heritage. Evolutionary psychologists then take this further, proposing that human behaviors we consider foundational to morality, such as the urge to protect kin, a sense of fairness, or the capacity for reciprocity, are not purely cultural inventions but evolved adaptations. The empathy an elephant shows for a distressed member of its herd, and the outrage a capuchin monkey exhibits when receiving an unequal reward for a task, are now studied not as divine parables, but as potential evolutionary precursors to human empathy and our powerful sense of justice. The medieval scholar who saw in the loyal dog a lesson in fidelity would instantly recognize the modern scientist studying oxytocin's role in bonding across mammalian species. The framework has shifted from the symbolic to the biological, but the underlying fascination with the animal-human moral connection endures. This historical thread also weaves subtly through the passionate modern debates surrounding animal rights and environmental ethics. The medieval view that animals were part of a divine plan and carried intrinsic value helped plant a seed that would much later blossom into arguments for their ethical consideration. While the medieval perspective was overwhelmingly human-centered, using animals as instruments for our moral education, it nonetheless established a precedent for seeing them as beings with a purpose and a place in a grand, meaningful order. Today, philosophers like Peter Singer argue for the moral consideration of animals based on their capacity to suffer, a utilitarian argument that nonetheless extends the circle of ethical concern beyond the human species. Deep ecologists and environmental ethicists push even further, suggesting that the natural world has value in and of itself, not merely for what it can teach or provide for humanity. This shift from instrumental value to intrinsic worth is a significant departure from medieval thought, yet the impulse to look at the natural world and derive an imperative for how we should behave within it is a direct continuation of that centuries-old conversation. We are still learning from the animal kingdom, but now the lesson is increasingly about coexistence, stewardship, and recognizing our own animality as part of, not separate from, the delicate web of life. Tracing this lineage from the scriptorium to the modern laboratory and ethics committee reveals something extraordinary. Those medieval scientists peering at bees and pondering pelicans were pioneers of a way of thinking that refuses to erect rigid walls between different domains of knowledge. They insisted that empirical observation of the physical world and philosophical reflection on how to live a good life were not just compatible, but were essential partners in the quest for truth. They championed a holistic approach that we, in our age of extreme specialization, often struggle to recover. This long historical perspective profoundly enriches our contemporary debates. It reminds us that our current scientific discussions about the biological roots of human behavior are part of an ancient human conversation, one that adds depth and context to the often contentious dialogue about nature versus nurture, free will, and the origins of morality. By understanding this history, we see that our urge to look to our fellow creatures for guidance is not a primitive superstition we have outgrown, but an enduring and perhaps essential part of understanding our own place in the universe, connecting us across the centuries in a shared, wonder-filled inquiry into what it means to be human. Now, this brings us to a fascinating crossroads between their world and ours, a place where we must carefully separate the threads of symbolic meaning from biological reality. The medieval Bestiaries and encyclopedias were filled with stories that we now know were based on misunderstandings or pure invention. The iconic tale of the mother pelican, piercing her own breast to feed her dying chicks with her blood, is a powerful and moving allegory for Christ's sacrifice. But zoologically, it is a myth, likely originating from the bird's habit of pressing its bill against its chest to fully empty its pouch of fish to feed its young. Similarly, the belief that elephants had no knees and therefore slept leaning against trees, making them easy to capture, was a complete fabrication that persisted for centuries. Modern science allows us to gently correct these inaccuracies, not to mock our ancestors, but to better understand both the natural world and the human impulse to find meaning within it. This process of critical examination doesn't diminish the medieval project. In fact, it enriches it by adding a new layer of understanding. We can now confirm, for instance, that the beehive they so admired is indeed a marvel of complex social organization, with intricate communication through dance, a precise caste system, and remarkable collective decision-making. The difference is that we understand this not as a conscious moral choice by the bees, but as the magnificent result of millions of years of blind evolutionary pressure. The bees are not intentionally modeling virtue, they are executing a deeply encoded biological program. This distinction is crucial. It allows us to appreciate the medieval insight that cooperation and specialization are pillars of a successful society, while grounding it in a modern scientific framework that explains the how and why without needing to assign conscious moral intent to the insects themselves. This creates a beautiful and productive dialogue across the centuries. We can look back at their interpretations and see not just errors, but a profound creativity and a desperate hunger to make sense of a mysterious world. Their method was a form of sense-making using the best tools they had: observation, inherited knowledge, and a powerful drive to find spiritual significance in everything they saw. In many ways, we are engaged in the same quest today, just with different tools. We use fMRI machines to study the neural correlates of empathy and genetics to understand the evolutionary roots of altruism, but we are still fundamentally asking the same question they did: what is the nature of goodness and where does it come from? Our science has given us a more accurate map of the territory, but the destination of a more ethical and meaningful life remains the same. Therefore, the most respectful and useful approach we can take is one of balanced appreciation. We can wholeheartedly embrace the allegorical and ethical value of these animal stories while simultaneously acknowledging their empirical shortcomings. The pelican myth remains a potent symbol of selfless love, even if pelicans don't actually behave that way. The lesson of the ant continues to preach the virtue of preparedness, regardless of whether the ant consciously plans for the future. By holding both the symbolic truth and the biological truth in our minds at once, we honor the full depth of these historical texts. We get to keep the timeless wisdom about human nature and morality that they worked so hard to extract, while letting go of the factual errors that were simply products of a limited knowledge base. This isn't about choosing between science and symbolism. It's about weaving them together to create a richer, more nuanced understanding that benefits from both the poetic imagination of the past and the empirical rigor of the present. Perhaps one of the most stunning modern validations of this medieval intuition comes from the study of elephant behavior. Researchers have documented countless instances of elephants displaying what can only be described as profound empathy. When a member of the herd is distressed or injured, other elephants will often gather around, gently touching the suffering individual with their trunks, emitting low-frequency rumbles of consolation, and sometimes even attempting to help it stand or walk. They have been observed performing what looks like mourning rituals, lingering near the bones of deceased herd members, caressing the skulls and tusks with a palpable sense of reverence and loss. This isn't a simple, hardwired instinct for survival. It's a complex, emotional response to the suffering of another being. For medieval scholars who saw the elephant as a symbol of compassion and duty, these modern observations would feel like a powerful and moving confirmation. They believed they were reading a moral lesson written by God. Today, we might frame it as an evolved trait that strengthens social bonds, but the core observation remains strikingly consistent. Elephants, like humans, have a capacity for caring that extends beyond their immediate self-interest. This theme of deep social connection extends into the world of marine mammals, where the behavior of dolphins has equally captivated scientists. There are numerous, well-documented cases of dolphins supporting sick or injured pod members, taking turns to nudge them to the surface to breathe, a lifeguard duty that can last for days. Even more haunting are the accounts of dolphin mothers carrying their dead calves on their backs for weeks, a heartbreaking display of grief that is difficult to interpret as anything other than a profound sense of loss. These behaviors suggest a level of social attachment and emotional sophistication that forces us to reconsider the sharp line we often draw between human and animal emotion. The medieval Bestiary, in its own allegorical way, was pointing toward this same continuum of feeling. They used the loyalty of animals to shame humans into being better. Modern ethology shows us that this loyalty isn't just a handy metaphor, but a real, observable biological phenomenon with deep evolutionary roots. It appears that the capacity for deep social bonds and the pain that comes with their severing is a thread that runs through many intelligent species, a shared feature of social brains navigating a complex world. The biological machinery behind this shared emotional landscape is becoming increasingly clear thanks to advances in neuroscience. The discovery of mirror neurons provides a fascinating potential mechanism for how empathy might be hardwired into the brains of many social animals, including humans. These are specialized brain cells that fire not only when an individual performs an action, but also when they observe another individual performing that same action. If you see someone prick their finger and flinch, your own mirror neuron system lights up as if you had experienced the pain yourself. This neural mirroring is believed to be a fundamental building block of empathy, allowing us to understand and literally feel the experiences of others. Crucially, similar neural systems have been identified in primates and other mammals. This suggests that the empathetic response observed in the comforting elephant or the helping dolphin isn't just an anthropomorphic fantasy. It may be grounded in the same basic neural architecture that allows us to connect with each other's joy and suffering. The medieval scholar who spoke of a common natural law was groping toward this idea of a shared foundation for morality. Without the language of neurons or evolution, they intuitively sensed that the empathy they felt and the empathy they saw in animals were manifestations of the same universal principle. Furthermore, the field of evolutionary psychology has provided a powerful framework for understanding why these moral traits are so widespread. Behaviors like cooperation, altruism, and fairness, once thought to be uniquely human cultural inventions, are now seen as strategic adaptations that enhanced survival and reproductive success. The concept of reciprocal altruism explains why a vampire bat will regurgitate blood to feed a hungry roost mate who shared with it in the past. It's a calculated investment in a social safety net. Studies with capuchin monkeys famously demonstrated a clear sense of fairness. When one monkey saw another receive a superior reward for the same task, it would often refuse to participate further or even throw a tantrum, a clear display of outrage at an unjust transaction. These behaviors aren't driven by an abstract sense of ethics. They are pragmatic solutions to the challenges of living in groups. They promote stability, reduce conflict, and encourage mutual aid, making the entire group more resilient. This evolutionary perspective doesn't diminish these actions. It grounds them in a compelling scientific narrative. It suggests that our sense of morality isn't a divine implant or a purely cultural overlay, but is instead built upon an ancient, biological foundation that we share with many other social species. The medieval notion that virtue was natural finds an unexpected and powerful echo in the Darwinian idea that prosocial behaviors are evolutionarily conserved because they work. This convergence of medieval philosophy and modern science doesn't mean we should uncritically accept every animal allegory from a 13th century manuscript. They got plenty of the specifics wrong, often projecting human motivations onto instinctual behaviors or inventing fantastical tales to serve a moral lesson. A lion is not a morally noble king. It is a predator whose actions are driven by hunger and instinct. But what they got profoundly right was the overarching premise that the animal world is not a moral vacuum, but a rich repository of data on social organization, conflict resolution, and emotional connection. Their fundamental project, looking closely at the natural world to better understand our own moral impulses, was not a quaint superstition. It was a prescient form of inquiry that is only now being fully validated with the tools of genetics, neuroscience, and careful field observation. They were onto a profound truth that to understand the roots of human ethics, we must be willing to look beyond ourselves, to the elephants who console, the dolphins who grieve, and the monkeys who demand fairness, recognizing in their actions the deep, biological echoes of our own struggle to live together well. This medieval practice of looking to the animal kingdom for moral guidance forces us to confront a question that is just as potent today as it was 800 years ago. If a creature acting on pure instinct can demonstrate what looks like perfect loyalty, selfless sacrifice, or unwavering cooperation, what does that actually say about the nature of our own, supposedly superior human morality? Does the altruism of an elephant invalidate our ethical achievements, reducing them to mere biological programming? Or does it, in fact, do the exact opposite, elevating our moral acts by highlighting the incredible role of conscious choice? The medieval scholars were deeply fascinated by this paradox. They weren't threatened by the virtue they saw in beasts, they were humbled by it. They used these examples not to diminish humanity, but to hold up a mirror that revealed our own failings and our potential. A dog's fidelity was a silent rebuke to human treachery. An ant's diligence was a judgment against human laziness. This perspective was designed to cultivate a crucial virtue that is often in short supply: humility. It was a constant reminder that righteousness is not our exclusive invention, but part of a vast, shared natural order that we are invited to participate in, not dominate. This ancient sense of humility carries immense ethical weight in our modern world, particularly as we grapple with our relationship to the environment. The medieval view that animals are not just resources but repositories of wisdom and participants in a divine plan fundamentally challenges the anthropocentric mindset that has fueled so much ecological damage. If we were to truly adopt their perspective, to see the natural world not as a warehouse of commodities but as a living library of lessons on how to live, it would revolutionize our approach to environmental stewardship. It would foster a deeper, more innate compassion that extends beyond our own species. We might look at the intricate cooperation within a forest ecosystem, where trees communicate and support each other through fungal networks, and see not just a biological process, but a model for human community and interdependence. This isn't about sentimentalizing nature. It's about recognizing that morality might not be a walled garden exclusive to humanity, but a vast, interconnected landscape that we share with other conscious beings. This shift could be the key to addressing our current ecological crises, moving us from a stance of exploitation to one of partnership and reverence. Furthermore, this reflective approach holds up a critical lens to the character of modern society itself. Medieval thinkers derived their ethics from constant, intimate engagement with the rhythms of the natural world, the changing seasons, the behaviors of animals, the growth of plants. Our world, by contrast, is increasingly abstract, digital, and technologically mediated. We are more connected to global information networks than we are to the soil beneath our feet or the wildlife in our neighborhoods. This disconnect carries a real cost. Have we, in our pursuit of progress, lost touch with a fundamental source of wisdom that these earlier cultures valued? The medieval project suggests that answers to complex human problems, from fostering social justice to building sustainable communities, might not always be found in newer, more complex technologies, but in the ancient, time-tested patterns visible in nature. The beehive's model of distributive justice, where every member has a role that serves the whole, offers a powerful critique of vast economic inequality. The resilience of a mature ecosystem, built on biodiversity and mutualism, provides a blueprint for creating robust human societies that can withstand shock and stress. Ultimately, revisiting this medieval inquiry keeps a profoundly important conversation alive and urgently relevant. It invites us to continue their project, but with the advanced tools of modern science and ethics. We now understand that the wolf is not an allegory for pure evil, but a keystone species crucial to the health of an ecosystem. We can study the neuroscience of empathy in mice or the grief rituals of cetaceans. This deeper knowledge doesn't negate the medieval insight. It validates and deepens it, allowing us to build an ethic that is both scientifically informed and spiritually profound. By blending their sense of wonder with our empirical rigor, we can find fresh inspiration for tackling the great moral dilemmas of our time. The medieval scholars teach us that the path to a more ethical future might not require us to invent something entirely new, but to remember something very old, to look closely with humble and curious eyes at the world around us, and to learn from the other lives with which we share this planet. What truly set the medieval approach apart was not just their method, but their motivation, a profound and pervasive sense of wonder that transformed every observation into an act of reverence. This wasn't the dry, dispassionate analysis we sometimes associate with science today. It was a wholehearted, awe-filled engagement with a world they believed was shimmering with hidden meaning. Imagine the sheer marvel of seeing a flock of cranes for the first time, forming a perfect V in the sky, disappearing for months, and then returning with the seasons as if guided by an invisible hand. For a medieval mind, this was not merely a biological event to be catalogued. It was a breathtaking mystery. It was a performance that demanded an audience, a puzzle that cried out for an explanation, and a silent sermon on themes of guidance, trust, and divine providence. This emotional response, this jaw-dropping wonder, was the essential fuel for their entire intellectual engine. It was the spark that made them ask not only, "How does this work?" but more importantly, "What does this mean for us?" This sense of amazement ensured that their inquiry into morality was never a cold, detached exercise. It was a passionate, holistic pursuit that engaged the heart as much as the head. A scholar studying the intricate geometry of a spider's web wasn't just noting the efficiency of its design for catching prey. He was likely humbled by the artistry and patience on display, seeing in it a lesson on meticulous creation and the delicate, interwoven strength of a community. This emotional connection prevented their work from becoming a sterile academic game. It rooted their ethics in something tangible and beautiful, the observed world itself. Their treatises on virtue were not dry lists of rules. They were field guides to a universe alive with instruction, written with the excitement of someone who had just uncovered a vital secret. This fusion of heartfelt wonder and rigorous thought meant that every discovery, every classified behavior, came with a built-in sense of purpose and relevance. Understanding the world and understanding how to live well within it were not two separate projects. They were a single, glorious endeavor driven by a shared sense of awe. This approach offers a powerful model for us today, especially in an age where specialization often walls off scientific discovery from ethical reflection. The medieval thinker reminds us that curiosity and wonder are not childish emotions to be outgrown, but are in fact the very lifeblood of a meaningful ethical life. When we lose our capacity for amazement, when we see a sunset as merely light refracting or a bird's song as just a mating call, we risk disenchanting the world and severing the vital link between what is and what ought to be. Rekindling that sense of wonder encourages us to look closely, to ask bigger questions, and to see the world around us not as a mere resource to be exploited, but as a teacher. It invites us to find ethical inspiration not only in books and lectures, but in the cooperative hunt of a wolf pack, the resilient growth of a weed through cracked concrete, or the patient, silent wisdom of an ancient tree. By placing wonder at the center of the quest for knowledge, these medieval creators built a tradition where science and morality were inseparable partners, joined together by genuine fascination. They teach us that the journey to a more ethical existence can, and perhaps should be filled with gasps of surprise, moments of stunned silence, and the joyful excitement of connecting a tiny detail in nature to a massive truth about the human condition. This emotional and intellectual partnership makes the study of ethics not a burdensome duty, but an adventurous exploration, a continuous conversation with a universe that is far more strange, beautiful, and instructive than we often allow ourselves to see. What made the medieval approach to animal behavior so uniquely powerful was its refusal to accept the artificial boundaries between different types of knowledge that we often take for granted today. For a scholar like Albertus Magnus, there was no such thing as a purely scientific observation divorced from theological meaning or philosophical implication. His world was not divided into separate departments of biology, theology, and ethics. Instead, it was a unified field of inquiry where every fact, every creature, and every behavior was a single piece of a vast, interconnected puzzle designed by a divine intelligence. This wasn't a simple mash-up of different disciplines. It was a deeply integrated methodology where each way of knowing actively informed and enriched the others. A detailed observation of a bird's migratory pattern wasn't just data for a natural history catalogue. It was also a piece of evidence for a philosophical argument about natural law and a theological lesson on divine providence and guidance. The empirical, the spiritual, and the ethical were not competing narratives but different voices in a harmonious choir, all singing the same song about the order and meaning of creation. Albertus Magnus stands as the supreme embodiment of this synthetic genius. This 13th century Dominican friar was a relentless investigator of the natural world, producing massive, detailed volumes on topics ranging from the mineral kingdom to the anatomy of animals, often based on his own direct observations and even dissections. He would meticulously describe the breeding habits of birds or the medicinal properties of plants with the keen eye of a field biologist, but he never stopped there. For Albertus, this physical description was merely the first step. The next was to ask what this physical reality revealed about the nature of the Creator who designed it and the moral lessons it could offer to humanity. His monumental work on animals is a perfect case study. In it, he combines razor-sharp empirical details correcting errors in Aristotle's texts based on his own investigations with profound theological reflections. He might describe the weasel's method of giving birth through its ear, a piece of folklore he accepted, and then seamlessly pivot to using the weasel as an allegory for how Christians should receive the Word of God, through the ear, in hearing, leading to the birth of Christ in the soul. For him, the how of a creature's life always pointed to the why of its existence in God's plan. This integrated method created a feedback loop of understanding that prevented knowledge from becoming shallow or one-dimensional. Data from nature provided the raw material for deeper spiritual insights, and those spiritual insights, in turn, guided which questions to ask and what to look for in the natural world. A theological belief that God's wisdom was reflected in creation motivated more careful and detailed empirical observation. The philosophical framework of Aristotelian causality provided the tools to categorize and make sense of what was observed. And the ethical imperative to live a virtuous life gave the entire project its ultimate purpose and meaning. This prevented the kind of fragmentation we sometimes see in modern academia, where a scientist might study animal behavior solely for its mechanistic causes. A theologian might contemplate ethics solely through scriptural analysis, and a philosopher might reason about morality in a vacuum, abstracted from the real world. The medieval model insisted that these paths were not meant to be walked alone. They were meant to converge, each one illuminating a part of the path that the others could not fully light on their own. This deeply holistic perspective offers a compelling challenge to our own modern ways of seeking truth, especially when it comes to a subject as complex as human morality. The medieval example suggests that to truly understand why we feel a sense of fairness, why we value loyalty, or why we are capable of great sacrifice, we cannot rely on a single lens. Neuroscience can show us the brain circuits that light up during empathetic responses, and that is invaluable. Evolutionary psychology can offer theories on how these traits enhanced our ancestors' survival, and that is crucial. But philosophy allows us to debate the nature of goodness that these impulses point toward, and theology might frame it as a reflection of a creator's character. No single discipline holds the entire picture. By drawing on diverse fields, by allowing data, reason, and spiritual inquiry to speak to one another, we can build a richer, more three-dimensional understanding of ourselves. The medieval scholars teach us that the most profound truths are often found at the intersections, in the fertile ground where different ways of knowing meet and cross-pollinate. Their legacy is an invitation to tear down the walls between our own intellectual silos and pursue a more unified and perhaps more complete vision of knowledge and virtue. Of course, the medieval world was not a monolith of uncritical belief, and this fascinating project of reading morality into nature was not without its significant blind spots. The very lens through which they viewed the animal kingdom, a beautiful fusion of faith, philosophy, and nascent science, was also shaped and sometimes distorted by the powerful cultural and historical biases of their time. We must remember that these scholars were not dispassionate observers floating above their own era. They were deeply embedded within a society defined by feudalism, a pervasive Christian worldview, and a limited understanding of the globe. This context inevitably colored their interpretations, often leading them to see in animals not what was objectively there, but what their pre-existing beliefs and symbolic systems prepared them to find. Their Bestiaries and encyclopedias, for all their wonder, were as much reflections of the medieval mind as they were of the natural world, and this means they sometimes projected human prejudices onto creatures who were simply going about their lives. Nowhere is this bias more starkly evident than in the treatment of the serpent. Across countless medieval texts, the snake is almost universally vilified, depicted as a slithering embodiment of deceit, temptation, and pure evil. This wasn't an interpretation born from careful field observation of its role in controlling rodent populations or its fascinating biology. This was a prejudice directly imported from the pages of the Bible, specifically from the story of the Garden of Eden, where a serpent tempts Eve, leading to the fall of man. That single, powerful narrative cast a long shadow over the entire species, transforming a limbless reptile into a permanent theological villain. Its physical form, crawling on its belly was interpreted not as an evolutionary adaptation, but as a divine curse, an eternal mark of its sin. This symbolic baggage was so heavy that it completely overrode any objective analysis. A medieval naturalist wouldn't ponder the efficiency of a snake's venom for subduing prey. He would instead see it as a physical manifestation of the poisonous nature of sin itself. The creature's actual behavior and ecological value were rendered invisible beneath the weight of this powerful, predetermined symbolism. Conversely, we see the opposite effect at work with animals that were elevated to near impossible heights of nobility. The lion, the so-called king of beasts, was saddled with a host of idealized traits that had little to do with the actual life of a large predator. Bestiaries attributed to lions a sense of magnanimity, claiming they would mercifully spare a defeated enemy who surrendered. They were said to sleep with their eyes open, a symbol of eternal vigilance, and to erase their tracks with their tails to evade hunters, a sign of regal cunning. While lions are indeed magnificent and powerful creatures, these specific tales were more about constructing a perfect mirror for human kingship than about documenting zoological fact. The lion became a blank screen onto which medieval society projected its highest ideals of leadership, strength tempered by mercy, authority combined with wisdom, and power exercised with a sense of justice. This idealization served a social purpose, providing a model for human rulers to aspire to, but it also created a sanitized and frankly inaccurate portrait of the animal itself, ignoring the raw, immoral reality of its existence as an apex predator. This tendency to categorize animals into simplistic boxes of good and evil based on their symbolic utility led to a kind of moral shorthand that could be deeply misleading. The pig, for instance, was almost universally condemned as a symbol of gluttony and filth due to its omnivorous diet and habit of wallowing in mud. This association was powerfully reinforced by biblical injunctions that deemed it unclean. But this moral judgment completely overlooked the animal's intelligence and its ecological role. Similarly, the goat, often linked to lust and devilry due to its perceived lecherousness and the medieval depiction of the devil with goat-like features, was condemned for behaviors that are simply part of its natural reproductive strategy. These weren't neutral observations, they were moral condemnations disguised as natural history. The animals were rarely given a fair trial. They were sentenced by the court of cultural symbolism before any evidence of their actual lives could be presented. Recognizing these biases is not an exercise in judging the past by modern standards. It is instead a crucial tool for engaging with these historical texts in a thoughtful and productive way. It allows us to appreciate the incredible creativity and spiritual depth of the medieval project while also holding its conclusions lightly. We can marvel at the allegory of the self-sacrificing pelican as a beautiful piece of theological art, while also understanding that it is not a zoological fact. We can admire the use of the beehive as a model for social harmony, while also acknowledging that it simplifies the often brutal and competitive realities of both insect and human societies. This critical approach allows us to be inspired by the wisdom they extracted without feeling obligated to accept their every conclusion uncritically. We are free to take the best of what they offered: their sense of wonder, their search for universal patterns, their belief that the world is full of meaning, while leaving behind the cultural baggage that no longer serves us. This process of critical reflection also holds up a mirror to our own time, revealing a profoundly important truth about the nature of ethical inquiry itself. It highlights that all interpretation is contextual. Just as medieval thinkers were influenced by their religious and feudal worldview, we too are shaped by our own set of contemporary values, our emphasis on individualism, our scientific materialism, our growing environmental consciousness. Our modern interpretations of animal behavior, while far more empirically rigorous, are not perfectly objective either. We might be prone to anthropomorphize animal emotions based on our own sentimental attachments, or to interpret their behaviors through the lens of modern economic theories like competition and cooperation. The medieval example teaches us humility, reminding us that our own understanding is provisional and filtered through our cultural moment. The goal, then, is not to achieve a perfect, bias-free perspective, an impossible task, but to become acutely aware of our own lenses, to question our assumptions, and to engage with the natural world with a spirit of openness, allowing the animals themselves, in all their complexity, to challenge and refine our understanding of what is right, what is natural, and what it truly means to live good life. Throughout this exploration, we've journeyed across centuries and continents, from the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries to the modern research labs of ethologists, tracing a single, powerful thread: the human desire to find moral wisdom in the natural world. What began for those medieval scholars as a sacred reading of God's second book, the Book of Nature, has evolved into a complex dialogue between science, philosophy, and ethics, yet the core intuition remains astonishingly alive. They looked at a beehive and saw a model for a just society. They observed a dog's loyalty and derived a lesson in fidelity. They marveled at a bird's migration and found a parable for divine guidance. Their methods blended careful observation with rich allegory, creating a unique form of science that served a higher purpose, not just to catalogue the world, but to understand our place within it and to decipher a guide for living a good life. This medieval project resonates so deeply today because it speaks to a fundamental human yearning to see our own struggles and virtues reflected in the world around us, to feel that we are part of a larger, meaningful order. While we may no longer believe that pelicans sacrifice themselves in the way they described, or that elephants have no joints, we are still engaged in a version of their quest. The language has changed, but the music is familiar. When a modern evolutionary biologist studies the altruistic behavior of vampire bats who share blood meals with hungry roost mates, they are investigating the same principle of reciprocity that a medieval preacher might have praised in the ant. When a neuroscientist maps the mirror neurons that fire in our brains when we witness pain in others, they are uncovering the biological machinery behind the empathy that medieval thinkers saw in the comforting rituals of elephants. We have traded allegory for anatomy, divine plan for Darwinian adaptation, but we are still asking that most profound of questions: where does our morality come from, and what can the rest of creation teach us about it? This enduring quest is perhaps more urgent now than ever before. As we navigate global challenges, from devastating environmental crises to deep social fractures and a pervasive sense of disconnection, the medieval invitation to look outward with humility and curiosity feels less like a historical footnote and more like a vital prescription. Their approach offers a corrective to the arrogance of anthropocentrism, the belief that humanity is the sole center of moral significance. By seeing animals not just as resources but as potential teachers, they cultivated a humility that is desperately needed in an age of climate change and mass extinction. They remind us that wisdom isn't always found in newer, more complex technologies, but often in the ancient, time-tested patterns of the natural world. The resilience of a mature ecosystem, the cooperation of a wolf pack, the adaptability of a species under pressure, these are not just biological facts. They are sources of inspiration for building human societies that are more sustainable, just, and compassionate. So, what is the ultimate legacy of these medieval scientists and moralists? It is the powerful, liberating idea that the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of virtue are not separate paths, but are meant to walk hand in hand. They refuse to compartmentalize their wonder, allowing their amazement at a spider's web to fuel both a scientific inquiry into its structure and a philosophical reflection on patience and artistry. They teach us that a life of the mind and a life of ethics can be nourished by the same source, an attentive, reverent engagement with the incredible diversity of life with which we share this planet. Their work stands as an enduring testament to the human spirit's insatiable curiosity and its profound desire to live a good life, suggesting that the answers we seek might be found not only in dense philosophical texts or sacred scriptures, but in the buzzing of bees, the flight of birds, and the steadfast gaze of a loyal companion. They invite us to step outside, to look closely, and to listen, for the world is still speaking if we are only